So who are you?
I'm Ernie Booth, Windows Vista Technical Evangelist, and I'm here today with part of our install team for Windows Vista. So,
cool.
Who are you?
I'm Tyler Robinson. I'm one of the program managers on the Windows installer.
And who are you?
I am Carolyn Napier. I'm the development lead for Windows Installer.
And what's new about Windows Installer for Windows Vista?
I'll go ahead and get started, I guess.
And what is the installer? Is the installer...
So unlike the name says Windows Installer, we do not install Windows. We actually are the application installation engine on the platform.
That's what it says.
It's a common misconception, and we've been around since, I guess 1999. We originally were part of Office 2000. And then we've sort of been shipping in the platform ever since. So what we've been working on for Vista is we've been working on Windows Installer 4.0. And we've targeted some features that are targeted specifically at, kind of lighting up on Vista. So we have some really interesting things involving the Restart Manager, which you might have heard about, which essentially mitigates reboots on the system. So essentially, one of the big problems with application and actually OS updates, right, is that if you're installing a patch to an application or even the OS, files might be being held in use, and then people will have to reboot at the end of the install. So the nice thing is that there's this Restart Manager functionality in Windows Vista that will essentially, you can ask the Restart Manager, hey, here's all my files that I want to update, see if they're being held in use. If they are being held in use, go ahead and shut them down, and then you can go ahead and apply the update, and then restart back up the apps that are holding the files in use at the end.
So what does that do to the apps?
Well, so the apps can actually do a few things. If it's just like a regular app that might just listen to shutdown messages and stuff, it might just shut down. It might pop up with the dialog that says, hey, do you want to save your data, stuff like that. One of the things we're evangelizing with the Restart Manager and with Windows Installer is this concept of sort of saving your state, not prompting the user when it gets shut down. So the whole idea is that the app can essentially receive this shutdown message. It'll save its state, save everything the user is working on, go ahead and shut down, update itself, and then start back up at the end of the install. So essentially, it's just like the app was never shut down, and to the user it could be completely transparent if it happens at like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning or something like that. So we've got that, and I can show a demo of that a little bit later. Some of the other stuff...
So is your code that's... Because we just had an update go through. Is your code the one that reboots Windows?
Is the Windows Installer the one that reboots Windows? Yeah, so right now the Windows Installer, when you update the Windows Installer on a Windows system, you require...
No, I'm talking about last night all these patches came by and forced my machine to reboot.
Oh, that's auto-update, essentially doing that. So those are like OS level patching. So OS level patches aren't done by the Windows Installer, but in Windows Vista, the OS level patches also integrate with the Restart Manager. So whether you're doing application updates or OS updates, it'll use the Restart Manager to try and mitigate that. Now, obviously, it can't mitigate all reboots, but it can mitigate a large portion of them. So anyhow, we've got that we've been working on. We've also been working on a lot of stuff for Lua or UAP. I think I saw a Channel 9 thing about that you guys already talked to them. So
limited user
account.
Yeah, limited user access or user account protection is the latest thing. So we've done a whole lot of work to integrate there because they sort of have this sort of blanket installer detection where it detects setup.exes and makes some assumptions and says, well, all setup packages sort of require admin credentials, so it'll request admin credentials, and the user will have to consent to that and everything. Since we sort of have this heritage of being designed for Office and lockdown environments and deployments to limited user environments and the corporate environment already, we sort of looked at that and said, well, gosh, we can do a whole bunch of really cool things there to sort of limit the amount of prompting that users are going to get, and there's some really interesting things that we've done there. Actually, Carolyn's been working a whole lot on that, and we actually have a demo of those things. So, I don't know, do you want to go ahead and kind of talk about that a little bit?
Go ahead and show a little bit.
Sure.
So basically I'm logged in as me right now, and even though I'm a member of the administrators group, I'm actually not running as an admin. This is the way that user account protection is working by default. So I'm actually going to attempt to perform an installation of this little app called Note Writer. And we'll just navigate here through the UI sequence to perform the install. And then you'll note that it'll ask me, hey, do you want to continue with this installation? I need to elevate to perform this operation. So this is bringing our corporate elevation scenarios to the home. So the install completes here. I'm installing the program files and everything like that. And so now I have my actual, if I go here to the start menu, here's our little V10 of our Note Writer app.
Sorry about the black line.
Right. So,
we got the right video driver loaded, so we can change that.
So we've also done some changes here for patching, which some of you may have seen in our 3.0 and 3.1 releases, but we've extended that in Windows Vista to enable you to apply patches that were already sort of pre-bus with the package. So when I authored the NoteWriter installation package, I had this table called the MSI patch certificate table, and I actually referenced a certificate. This is a certificate that I'll be using to sign the future patches that I release for my application. And the way that this works is if I'm a Lua user and I apply the patch, as long as its cert matches what I had originally authored in the package or in subsequent patches that I released, then I can actually apply the patch without requiring prompting. So here, I'm actually going to apply the patch to NoteWriter. I'm going to say yes to update it, and it's actually going to now go and update the NoteWriter application to v11, and we can see that the change was actually made here. You'll note the color change from green to blue here, and also it says Northwinds NoteWriter 1.1. So I've updated the version of my app. Now, the other cool thing is, because I was a Lua user that applied my application patch, I can also uninstall that patch that I applied without also requiring elevated privileges. So I can just navigate here to Installed Updates, click on NoteWriter, select Remove, and now I'm going to uninstall this update from my machine. And then if we go back to the shortcut to run the app, you'll note that it now uninstalled the patch. The application has been returned to its previous version before the patch was applied. And then the final thing here is I can actually go back to my installed programs. Now, we've always said that, low rights users can't uninstall per machine installed apps, or these highly impactful apps here, but I can actually now, with this integration, I can begin to perform the uninstall of the NoteWriter app, and again, it's going to ask me if I want to continue this operation. So yes, I want to complete this operation, and now NoteWriter has actually been removed from the machine.
Interesting. So I didn't actually have to put a password in to do that.
No, so they've changed it. Usually, if you're a member of the administrator group, but you're running as the non-admin, then the credential prompts that you usually get are just to say yes or no to the operation. However, if you were not initially a member of the admin group, you'd be provided with a credential prompt that actually would ask you for a username and password of an administrator on the box.
And the really nice thing about this is this really, a lot of people have these applications out there that sort of auto-update themselves, right? They'll go and download a patch or something like that. And that's kind of been a concern under UAP, because the concern is that, well, the app is running with low rights, and it's going to go ahead
What's
and
UAP?
User account protection. So
Okay.
Lua UAP, sorry.
Yep.
We use them sort of interchangeably, but UAP is supposedly the new term we should be using. So anyhow, so the application will sort of download a patch, and it might not be able to install it because it might not have the appropriate rights to do it, or it might be executing it in some way that the installer detection can't really detect and elevate properly. The nice thing about this is if you sign your MSI packages today, if you insert that certificate that Carolyn showed, you essentially have enabled your application to have this sort of automatic updating ability under UAP even, and there's no need to enter a credential, trusted or enter your password or stuff like that. So
Right.
it's a much more seamless experience than other install technologies because we're reducing the amount of prompts that people are going to get.
Now, how do you get the certificates?
The certificates is any sort of regular certificate that you would have. So it's,
For Authentico.
yeah.
So now, if I'm not an administrator, you're in my admin, you install some program, I'm running, a patch comes out. Can I choose to update that patch?
Yeah, so the idea is if you're not an administrator, right? So if, let's say, you're Toby running on the system, it'll still, as long as the administrator originally installed it, then it's going to go ahead and use the signed patch and allow you to upgrade it even though you don't have administrative privileges. Now the interesting thing is that a system administrator can go through and sort of block this functionality clearly, right? Because system administrators might not want all their users going to websites and randomly downloading patches. So system administrators can turn that off through policy.
What do developers need to know about how to build this?
So the great thing is that
Where should they start?
The great,
First of all,
yeah. So the great thing is,
or?
So there is on MSDN we have our SDK on MSDN. So if you actually go to I forget what the whole path to it is. If you just go to the Windows installer start page on MSDN, it has all the documentation there for version 3.1 of the Windows installer. The great thing about this patching functionality is it's all based on Windows installer 3.1 features. It's just sort of enhanced in Vista. So you look at the documentation for the patch certificate table. You look at the documentation for, I forget exactly what the topic is called in 3.1. Is it called administrator patching for games or something like that, I
Right,
think is what it's
yeah.
called. So if you look up that topic in the 3.1 SDK, you actually get all the information you need to be able to include this in your installations today. And that's kind of a theme we've been following with the Vista stuff, is we've sort of been saying, well, we want to design stuff so that people can do things today, so that when Vista actually ships, their installs will just work. And the great thing is that when you have a patch or an MSI file that uses this functionality, it doesn't actually require MSI 3.0 or 3.1 or 4.0. This functionality is just kind of ignored down level. So if you design an MSI package and a patch to take advantage of this functionality, but you run it on a system that has the Windows installer that doesn't support it, it'll just get ignored down level.
So what's the version in Windows Vista?
It's 4.0 that's going to be in
4.0.
Windows Vista. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a tool to help developers build, install, to deploy their apps once they get them built up?
Deploy the apps?
Well,
once they build them? Okay.
Yeah.
There are several tools that people can use to deploy the app. So first of all, the Windows installer is integrated with group policy. So group policy software deployment can be used to deploy MSI files. There's also several tools. For example, SMS has integration with the Windows installer as well for deployment. So there's dozens of tools out there for deployment. Most of your major tools that system administrators would use to deploy software are integrated with the Windows installer. As far as authoring tools go, there's also a number of those, right? There's Install Shield, there's Wise, there's Wix, which a lot of people have heard about, the Windows Installer XML open source project. We have tools in the SDK, and there's also tools that are part of Visual Studio that people can use to build packages.
Install Shield actually uses
The
your
Windows
APIs then to
Yeah,
actually create the installs.
It's a little bit more complex than that, because the tools like Install Shield and Wise actually have they have their own engine, right? So Install Shield has their thing called the install script engine, and then they can also generate Windows installer packages. So it's depending on in their tool how you decide you want to author your install. It may or may not be using the Windows installer. But yeah, a common misconception is that, well, gosh, the Windows installer is competition to Install Shield or Wise, but actually they have complementary tools for us.
Why would you choose one or the over the other? Why do you still need Install Shield?
A lot
If
of
you guys have done your job so well.
That's an interesting question. I actually used to work at Install Shield for 8 years, so I'm actually able to answer this question quite well. The main reason is because the Windows installer is a very different paradigm than you think of like Install Shield based installs. The old world of installs was very script based. It was very, make this registry entry, install this file, do this, do that sort of thing. The Windows installer is completely sort of data driven, declarative format, so it's very different than what people are used to. And it was difficult for people to migrate over from old install technologies to the Windows installer. To really get all the benefit of the Windows installer, you sort of have to make the conscious decision and say, okay, I've looked at the features of the Windows installer, I've decided I want, this good deployment scenarios and this customization functionality and the robustness and all these cool things that the Windows installer offers. But in order to do that, you have to make that conscious decision, and you essentially have to take all your old install code and throw it out. And some of these people would have 20, 30,000 lines of custom written install script code that they weren't willing to essentially take and throw out and reinvest in new installs. And they realized that trying to migrate that stuff over directly to the Windows installer wasn't the right way to go. So a lot of people have kept around old scripted install technologies, and it works for a lot of people. A good example is, for example, the Nullsoft install system, which a lot of people use if you go to, for example, download.com, right? It's very easy to use, it's open source, it's free, and it's fast, and it works for a lot of people with small little internet download applets. So, the Windows installer has a huge surface area, but it really, it can't solve everybody's problems, and we realize the fact that on the ends there's other install technologies that people will use. But we're always trying to improve the Windows installer so that, working in conjunction with our tools vendors to, make it so that the Windows installer has the widest surface area of the install technologies out there, and that it's the best choice for most people.
So in Whidbey there's Click Once.
Mm-hmm.
In the Vista time frame, is Windows installer a replacement for Click Once?
So the story that we've been telling, the story that we gave at the PDC essentially is that, again, it's sort of recognizing the fact that the Windows installer can't be all things to all people. So Click Once has a very good story for completely managed, applications that are focused on the .NET Framework 2.0 or higher, and need this sort of web deployment model that Click Once has. And this is a very good model for these type of apps and line of business apps and stuff like that. So if you can deploy using Click Once, we highly recommend that people should do it, because it's a very, I'm sure you've seen inside of Visual Studio, it's a very easy to use deployment model. It's very quick and very easy for developers to essentially build an app, create a deployment for it, and go ahead and actually deploy that app. So if you can use Click Once, we're recommending that people do it. But there's a whole other universe out there where you have impactful applications that aren't isolated, or you have a lot of applications that are partially managed, partially unmanaged, things like that, right? And in that case, MSI is going to be your best choice. And actually, we're working with people to figure out ways that we can build bridges ultimately in the long run between that, right? Because we don't want people to essentially say, well, I've started with Click once, and now I need to use MSI, but now I need to start over again. So we're working on making sure that in Vista we have some bridges in place so that people will easily be able to move from one to the other. I can actually talk a little bit more about the Restart Manager stuff if you guys want to see that a little bit, because
Sure.
I have a demo of that. And this was actually the most popular demo at the PDC. I was actually quite surprised. A lot of people applauded for it. I understood that reboots were a big pain point for customers. I didn't realize how excited people would be about this functionality. So, go ahead and bring this up here. So I got a Vista machine running here, and this demo uses the same note writer application that Carolyn was showing earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and you also note also that this was actually built with Install Shield, so kind of showing the fact that they actually build Windows installer packages. So I've gone ahead and installed the note writer application. I can go ahead and pull it up, and again we have our version 1.0. Now this note writer application, I mentioned earlier that you can design your application so it'll listen to the shutdown messages, it'll start back up at the end of the install, and it'll save its state. So you can actually go here, and I'm going to go ahead and type into note writer here some stuff, right? Just dirty it up a little bit, and then go down here and maybe resize the window and move it around a little bit. And what I have here is I have this patch deploy batch file, which is something that you might see in an enterprise where they're going to deploy the patch through the enterprise. The difference is I'm running it with a basic UI as opposed to a silent UI to show you how we pop up and tell the user that the application needs to be shut down. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you'll see that it started the installation process, and now it says the following applications need to be closed before continuing the installation, and it says Note Writer. And I have this option that says, hey, go ahead and automatically close those applications for me and start them up at the end of the install. So you see it shut down Note Writer. We have version 1.1 available with the blue background, but it also saved all the state and everything. It shut down without asking the user for anything, without prompting the user. So this could have been done completely silently. If I was running a silent install, like a corporate deployment scenario, that dialog would have never popped up. Note Writer would have shut down, would have saved its state, and then popped back up, and the user might have come back into the office in the morning, would have never noticed the difference.
Will it save state in a web browser? Because if I have a weblog entry in a web browser, will it come back with a weblog entry there?
So the application has to be written to save its state. So it depends on how the application responds to the shutdown message. If the application responds to the shutdown message by popping up with a dialog that says, hey, do you want to save this? Then you're coming to work in the morning and it's going to have that dialog popped up and says, hey, do you want to save this still? The Note Writer application was written so that the state is just saved. So this is the kind of thing we're evangelizing to people because we'd like to have it so that when Vista comes out, there's already applications out there that are designed to save their state in this way, so that you don't have the question of, well, gosh, what if I have a weblog or something like that there.
So how long does it take to actually use the Restart Manager and write an app like that to restart the state?
So the interesting thing is that as far as the Windows installer is concerned, it's a very easy process. We actually designed it so that, for corporate deployments, you don't have to do anything in your Windows installer package. If the application is being deployed silently, then we just go ahead and try and shut down the applications. Now, of course, the application isn't designed to respond to shutdown messages, and that's not going to mitigate the reboot. But hopefully, it's, the idea of shutting down responding to shutdown messages isn't something new overall. It's just something that we're evangelizing more heavily for Windows Vista. So as far as the MSI is concerned, for silent deployments and stuff, you don't actually have to do anything. And even if you already have an install that exists out there today, when you deploy it silently in your enterprise, it's going to go ahead and try and mitigate those reboots. If you want the sort of full UI support, you just have to author one new dialog in your MSI package, and that is something that we provide in the SDK that you can just import into your currently existing UI. So it's a very easy process as far as MSI is concerned. Now, when you start talking about, well, gosh, my application needs to save its state and all sorts of interesting things like that, I guess it becomes, well, how complex is your application, right? Is it easy like Note Writer? In that case, it's something that we wrote essentially in one day. But if it's something complex like Office, well then, there's a lot more decisions you have to make about what state you're going to save and how you're going to save it and things like that. So it's sort of hard to quantify that.
Now, I've seen Office, and they actually do save all their state out, right? Mm-hmm. Including, like, if I have my cursor at a certain line in a certain place.
Yeah.
So,
and that's also how deep you're going to save your state, right? I think in Note Writer, for example, you won't see, for example, it didn't save where your cursor was in the document, right? So it's those decisions that you have to make about how much state you want to save. But go ahead.
So are those the two big features of Windows Installer then?
Those are our primary features, but there are a whole bunch of other interesting things we have that we've been working on. Do we want to talk about the MUI stuff a little bit?
We can show a little bit of MUI stuff.
What is MUI?
So MUI is multiple user interface. So basically it's allowing, the general design is you usually have a single set of binaries that are language neutral, and then you have your set of satellite binaries that are the different languages that you support. And that way, on like a single machine, with different users logging on and perhaps having different languages of their preferred language, their UI will adjust based upon their language. So you have basically language switching on the fly. So with MSI, what we were doing is actually enabling applications to register their shell shortcuts so that they're actually capable of being MUI, so that when different users log on, the app's UI can change. Now, of course, this means that you need to design your application with MUI in mind, but for shortcuts, it's pretty simple. There's just 4 new columns to our existing shortcut table. So like Tyler's been mentioning, this is designed to light up on Vista. So what this means is that if you author a package with these 4 new columns and you deploy on a down-level machine, the columns are ignored. You're going to still be able to use this exact same package. So here, what you're seeing is the reference is actually to a file path, and then the ID is the index to the resource in that actual file. So when we install this actual package here, this is actually going to create 2 shortcuts on our desktop. And you'll see it says ampersand install and ampersand uninstall. So this is an English user, and these 2 shortcuts are referencing the English text. And then this is on the application side of things. In MSI as well, we've also fully adopted MUI. You're probably familiar with the fact that MSI has been a worldwide binary since we released. We have supported all languages. But now we've separated our languages from our actual code binary. And, based on the user, here's the property sheet. When you right-click on a patch, you'll note that, apply here is in English. So I'm going to take this same machine here, and I'm actually going to switch users and switch to a different user that has Japanese text as their preferred language. So you note here, the shortcut names here actually change. Now, it's not fully localized yet, so you'll see what we call pseudo-loc, which is sort of an approximation of what the language would be. But you'll note that these did change from their English text, and then also for the patch, that the property menu, so this is the MSI portion of it, also changed as well to reference the Japanese. So all we're enabling now is for application vendors to actually install apps that are capable of supporting MUI, like the operating system is today, and has been since Windows 2000.
No, why didn't the rest of that context menu change to Japanese, like the cut and the copy and?
Right. So with the way Windows is architected now, Windows Vista, you actually have to have the binaries set up. So this is a build that we specially did for the MSI context strings. Actually got some random localizations done for that, but this build does not have all the localization in place for the rest of the generic property items.
But that is a Windows Vista feature to be able
Yes.
to change localize, and that's
Exactly.
different because in the past when you installed, you actually had to choose, or was it a different set of? I don't know if you guys know this.
It was like a
different set of
separate
DVDs.
huge MUI pack that you'd have to install after the OS. But today the OS is installing as language neutral, and then you can select different language packs to actually include with the OS that gives you the multiple languages that you want.
Cool. So how much work is it to actually localize your install strings? And it looked like it was just a couple database entries and send
Right,
off to whoever does my actual localization.
Right, so your package authoring is relatively simple, right? There's 4 new columns there. Now, for file extensions, you just use the registry table and you follow the documented guidelines for how you reference your file extensions, so that you see the way this apply thing here works. And then it's part of your application as well. So you need to sort of re-engineer your application so that you separate your localizable data from your actual core binaries. So separate resources from code, and then localize those individual binaries. And then in your authoring, you're just referencing the resource IDs for those strings.
Cool.
Any other?
So, there's a number, there's always a grab bag of sort of small features that we've done. We've made some sort of generic improvements to our manageability story. We've improved our event log messaging and our logging functionality, added policies and things like that to control things. One of the other popular features that I wanted to mention is that we have the ability to turn on logging for a singular MSI package now. We've always had this ability where you can flip a bit in system policy and say, turn on logging for all my packages. And we heard from system administrators that, well, I don't really like that because it slows things down and takes up a lot of hard drive space depending on how many applications you're going to be installing and repairing and updating and uninstalling and things like that. And we've always had the ability to turn on the logging from the command line and say, well, just this time when I run this, do the logging. But what we'd actually heard was that, well, I have maybe 100 apps, and I know that 99 or 98 of them are well behaved and I don't have problems with them and I don't need logging turned on all the time. But I know that 2 or 3 or some handful of my apps, some known quantity of apps require logging. And in that case, I want to author into the package and say, always turn on logging just for this actual installation. So we have the ability to do that inside of the MSI packages today, and that's actually just authoring one property into our property table. And that's actually something that's been very popular with our system administrator customers when we've talked to them about that. One of the other interesting things I want to point on that I can't really say enough is the fact that, again, Carolyn mentioned it and I mentioned it, all our features are designed to just sort of light up on Vista, which means that I don't need to create a Windows installer package that will just install on Vista. I can create a Windows installer package that when I install it on version 2.0 of the Windows installer, which is kind of the oldest version out there that people generally benchmark on, it'll do a certain number of things. When I install it on 3.0, it'll take advantage of new features, and when I install that same package on 4.0, it'll take advantage of even more features. So that's kind of paradigm shift in thinking that people are traditionally used to saying, I have to ship the newest version of the Windows installer along with my installation package because I need to take advantage of the new features. And one of the things we're trying to talk to people about and evangelize to them is that you don't need to think of the world in that way as far as the Windows installer is concerned. You can just take advantage of these new features. You can design for them today even though we haven't shipped Windows Installer 4.0. So it makes it really easy for people to not have to redistribute the engine, not have to worry about rebooting the system. They can not have to worry about writing bootstrappers, right? A lot of people have these setup.exe bootstrappers. In the brave new world of UAP and Lua, a bootstrapper might get detected by the installer detection and sort of elevate randomly when you don't actually need to have that elevated. So we're trying to evangelize to people to say, hey, you should just create an MSI file, and unless you absolutely know you need a bootstrapper, then you should just go ahead and use the MSI file, because most people use a bootstrapper to drop the Windows installer on the system, but they don't necessarily need to install the latest version of the Windows installer. So we're asking a lot of people to think about that a little bit more carefully and think about the implications. As far as the UAP and Lua stuff is concerned, what we're asking people to do today is, if you test your Windows installer package in sort of a lockdown corporate environment and it works, the idea is that under Lua, it'll do the same thing, right? So if it just works in a corporate environment or a lockdown deployment scenario, then it should just work in Lua and UAP. And there's lots of documentation that we have in our SDK that gives people the do's and don'ts of things they can and can't do inside of their Windows installer package. Same thing with the Restart Manager stuff. They can go ahead and they can author their stuff in today, and we're asking people to go ahead and start authoring that dialog. We're going to be talking to our tools partners and making sure that they are aware of that so they build that into their tools. We really want to get to the point where when Vista comes out, just everything's sort of all set up for the Windows Installer 4.0, and that people have packages out there that work really well under Windows Installer 4.0 and on Vista, and that the tools are creating packages that are designed for Windows Installer and Vista.
So, is there any last advice to developers, something that maybe a lot of them do in their install packages that you kind of look at and go, oh, that's not like a good practice?
There's a lot of, best practices that we've sort of had along the way that a lot of people are probably aware of. I think probably the big thing that we see is people don't run their validation checks on their packages a lot. That a lot of people aren't aware that we have this whole set of validation tools that we ship in our SDK, and that these errors that the validation tools come up with, a lot of them are designed to avoid problems in like group policy deployment scenarios, which will be more important under Lua and UAP. So a lot of people don't run validation, they don't correct the errors, they just sort of look at them and say, well, I tested it and it works fine, so I don't understand why these errors are popping up. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we want to get people to do is remind them that they need to run validation on their packages and make sure they correct those errors.
Yeah, in particular, you don't need a launch condition for admin user. That'll be handled for you.
Yeah.
I mean, with Windows Vista and user account protection, and also with the legacy capabilities that we've had all along with installing for low privileged users, you do not need to check for admin user in your package. You can use privilege, which is a property that we use to identify if the user is performing the installation as an admin or the installation is being run elevated, because either you've given the blessing or an IT admin has given you the blessing to run the install elevated. But today there's really no need to check specifically, is this an admin user that's launching the install?
So, I've got a question for you. I know there's this new known folders API in Windows Vista, so I can add my own custom known folders. Is there anything in the new installer that takes advantage of that at all? Or is it still the same, like %sys directory % to say, install to my system directory instead of hard coding a C:\\.
Do you want to comment on that, or should I?
Well, I mean, MSI has always basically had well-known folders that were used. So we never recommend that you actually tried to build the folder yourself. We'd have properties like the Windows folder, the system folder, that we resolve properly for you based on those settings, including like My Documents and things like that. So we've always provided that, and we've always recommended that setup authors actually take advantage of that rather than using, building their own.
Yeah, so those things. So there's a set of folders that the Windows installer knows about, and that'll go ahead and resolve correctly on Vista, just like it does on down-level systems. Now there might be some new folder types that we don't have defaults for, and in that case, you would need to either program some custom code into your Windows installer package to go ahead and detect that and call out to that, or just code it into your package. So
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.